Welcome to the official How to Play video for Primordial Secrets. This is the complete rules, so we've got a lot to get through, but after watching this video, you will be able to skip the rulebook and head right into a full game. But first, what is this game actually about? In Primordial Secrets, players are building their own eldritch pantheon of unfathomable, godlike beings called Primordials. Your coterie of Primordials will start as a simple deck of lowly messengers and musicians, but throughout the game you'll be entreating more powerful entities to join your cause. Meanwhile, players will also be clashing with one another in a strange dance of intrigue, espionage, and existence-erasing sacrificial rituals to determine which pantheon will reign over the unborn universe for all eternity, and which will be forgotten, consigned to the great void where no mortal will ever be able to witness their beautiful terror. So, yeah. Primordial Secrets is, at its core, a deck-building game, meaning each player will be drawing from their own personal decks, which they will be gradually improving as the game progresses. Specifically, each round, players will have an opportunity to recruit primordial cards from a central marketplace called the Court. The recruited cards will go into your personal discard pile along with all the cards you played that turn. Whenever you need to draw, move, or reveal a card from your deck, but that deck has no cards left, flip your discard face down, shuffle it, and that becomes your new deck. Then you'll continue drawing from that new deck. And since you'll be drawing so many cards each round, you'll be cycling through it several times throughout the course of the game, full of more and more powerful cards each time you shuffle. So one of your main goals in Primordial Secrets is to make your deck better than your opponent's. But having the best deck is only part of the equation. In order to win the game, you will need to use those powerful cards wisely to actually outplay your opponent. Because each round, before you get to that recruiting phase, you will basically be comparing half of your hand against half of an opponent's hand to determine if you get to steal a secret guarded by that opponent, or if that opponent threw such an amazing party that you have to sacrifice one of your primordials. And collecting those secrets or sacrifices is how to actually win the game. I realize that last part probably didn't make much sense. Let's back up to the beginning. First of all, give each player one player mat. These mats aren't strictly required to play the game, but you can see with so many different zones, they make it much easier to keep everything straight, especially for the first few playthroughs. There are two main types of cards in the game, differentiated by their backs. Primordial cards have a bright red back with 4 symbols on it, representing the 4 different tribes of primordials. Intent cards have a maroon back with fingers pointing outward, indicating infinite possibilities. We'll need to pull out a few cards of each type to play a game. The primordial cards setup is nearly the same no matter how many players, but the intent cards used will vary depending on if it's a 2, 3, or 4 player game. Below the name on intent cards is a number, which indicates player count. You will use all 22 intent cards with a number 2 on them in a 2-player game, all 33 with a 3 on them for a 3-player game, or all 44 with a 4 on them for 4 players. Once you determine which intents to use, they should be divided up into identical sets of 11, one set for each player. Put the 5 maroon-framed starting intents face down onto the intent deck zone of each player's player mat, and slide the 6 black-framed secret intent cards halfway under the player's mat's secret zone. There's one special rally intent card that might be needed later if a certain primordial makes an appearance, but aside from that, the rest of the intent cards won't be used and can go back into the box or set aside. The most basic of the primordial cards are these starting deck cards that are white with a splash of brown at the bottom. Give each player a starting deck consisting of 7 messengers, 4 musicians, and 1 advisor. Each player should shuffle up this personal 12-card deck face down and place it on their primordial deck zone on their player mat. Everyone's personal mat is now ready to play. We just have to set up the court. The court is an area central to all players where the stronger primordial cards will be laid out, ready to be recruited by the players. Set all 30 familiar cards in one face-up stack in the court, then sort through the remaining 90 black and white framed court pawn cards, and set aside the cards with a 6, 7, or 8 tribute cost within the ball of flame in the upper right corner. These expensive cards will get shuffled back into the deck after round 2, but we can't have them clogging up the court before then. Shuffle up the remaining court pawn cards and place them in a face-down stack in the court. This is the pawn deck. Now we get to the most exciting cards, the black with a splash of brown royal primordials. Turn these 25, or 26 if you have the first edition, cards face down and shuffle them up. Then, without looking, remove cards until only 4 royals per player remain in the deck. The removed royals won't be used this game and can be returned to the box or set aside. The remaining small stack of cards is the royal deck. Deal 7 cards face up into the court from the pawn deck and 7 from the royal deck. These 14 cards, plus the familiars, are the cards players can choose to recruit on their turns. Lastly, give the first visitor token to the most ancient being among you, and you're ready to start playing. Each round of the game consists of 2 phases. The plotting phase, where everyone secretly sets up their plans for that round, and the visiting phase, where those plans play out in turn order. In the plotting phase, all players draw 6 cards from their personal primordial decks, and choose 3 to place face down into their visiting party, and 3 to place face down into their hosting party. Also at this point, each player chooses any one intent card from their intent deck to put face down into their visiting party in the visiting intent zone. The decision of which 3 cards to visit with and which 3 to host with is often the most important choice of the round, so take your time. Everyone is doing this plotting at the same time, so you're not holding anyone up. So, what makes a good visitor or a good host? To answer that, let's take a quick sidebar to have a closer look at a primordial card. At a baseline, all primordials have 3 stats: devotion, insight, and deceit. Devotion is what you use to recruit new cards for your deck, and when it comes time to recruit, you can only use your visiting primordial's devotion. So ideally, you'll put the 3 cards with the highest devotion in your visiting party. But of course, it's not that simple. Because before you get to do the fun part of recruiting, you have to check to see if you have to sacrifice one of your visitors first. And that's where these other 2 stats come in. The bottom line is insight, this blue pointing finger value, is a primordial's visiting power. And deceit, the purple mouth hand, is a primordial's hosting power. Some primordials, like this advisor, also have an effect, which will trigger at a certain time during the visiting phase, if it's in the right place. For example, this advisor's effect won't happen if it's in your visiting party, but if you put it in your hosting party, there's a good chance its win hosting effect will, as long as someone ends up visiting you. It's worth pointing out that there are almost no optional effects in this game, so if this advisor is in your hosting party when someone visits you, you will have to banish a card, even if you don't want to. All primordials also have a name, a tribe, and a class. These descriptors have no inherent effects, but certain cards will affect different tribes or classes differently, like this shade, who will silence all other royals at the party. The last thing to know about primordial cards is their cost. The orange flame number is the card's tribute cost. This is the cost that is paid for with that devotion I just mentioned. This white skull is a sacrifice cost. Only the endgame royal primordials have this additional sacrifice cost, which is paid for by having collected sacrifices from other players. More on that real soon. So, once everyone has made their decisions about where to place their 6 primordial cards and which intent card to use, the plotting phase is over, and we move on to the visiting phase. The first thing that happens during the visiting phase is the big reveal, where everyone should go ahead and turn all of the cards they played during the plotting phase face up. Now each player resolves their visit in turn order, starting with the player with the first visitor token, then moving clockwise. The resolution of a visit and the recruiting that follows is called a turn. During a turn, only the cards in the visiting player's visiting party and the hosting player's hosting party are referenced or affected, called visitors and hosts respectively. This might not be intuitive, so it's worth highlighting. On your turn, you are only looking at your visiting cards and someone else's hosting cards. If an effect on one of your visitors does something like silence all royal visitors and hosts, it's not affecting the whole table. It's only affecting the cards in your visiting party zone and another player's hosting party zone. You aren't physically moving your visitors, but you can think of it like they're all in the same room as someone else's hosts, dancing and whispering and performing rituals or whatever, and during your turn, that's the room we're zooming in on. There are 6 steps to a turn. First, you know who the visiting player is, that's whoever's turn it is, but you need to determine who the hosting player is for the turn, and that's where the intent cards come in. Basically, the direction the finger on your intent card is pointing indicates who you want to visit, so that player will be the host during the resolution of your turn, unless another player insists you visit them instead with a crooked finger intent card. Sidebar. Intent cards indicate who, if anyone, you plan to visit on your turn. But some have additional effects, such as modifying some of your stat totals during the round, or even forcing a player to visit you. Once obtained, the dark-framed secret intent cards operate exactly the same as the maroon-framed intent cards you start the game with. On every intent card, you will find one of these two symbols. The pointing finger we already covered. It indicates you plan to visit whoever it is pointing at. The other symbol is a wine glass, which indicates you don't plan to visit anyone at all on your turn. This essentially skips your turn. You won't compare your visitors to anyone's hosts, and you won't get to recruit. Some intent cards also have a crooked finger. This symbol can alter someone else's plans. These invitations override pointing fingers on other intent cards and will force a player to visit you instead of whoever they had planned to visit. The big numbers over the icons are the priority numbers. Whenever different intent cards are trying to make a player do different things, whichever icon has the lowest priority number takes precedence. That said, most of the time you could ignore these numbers entirely, as crooked fingers always trump pointing fingers, and the wine glass always trumps crooked fingers in a 3 and 4 player game, but not in a 2-player battle. The one time you will have to pay attention to these numbers is when two people both invite the same player. In that case, you will have to see which invitation is more enticing by referencing those priority numbers. The last thing to cover on intent cards is stat modifiers. The modifiers on intent cards always affect the player who played the intent, even if the directional portion of the card is overridden, and they affect that player's totals. Whenever that player is required to total up one of their stats at any point during the round, not just on their turn, add or subtract the modifiers from the total. And we're back. Okay, so once you know who you're visiting, it's time to resolve your visitors' effects and their hosts' effects. The timing of which effects resolve first is critical. First, resolve all before visiting effects on visitors in any order chosen by the visiting player. Then resolve before hosting effects on hosts in any order chosen by the hosting player. Then resolve the when visiting effects on visitors, then the when hosting effects on hosts. Now we total up the visitor's insight and the host's deceit and compare those values. This is the big stat check that determines if secrets are stolen or sacrifices are made, the two main victory conditions of the game. If the host's total deceit is greater than the visitor's total insight, the hosting player gains a sacrifice. That means the visiting player has to choose one of their visiting primordial cards to lose forever, immediately moving it from the visiting party into the hosting player's sacrifice zone, where it stays, face down, counting towards sacrifice costs on royals, and counting toward the victory condition of collecting 6 sacrifices. Conversely, if the visitor's total insight is higher than the host's total deceit by 4 or more, the visiting player steals a secret from the hosting player. That means they get to look through the hosting player's secrets zone and choose any secret intent card from there to move into their own intent discard zone. That secret will be usable as an intent card for the rest of the game, and counts toward the victory condition of stealing 6 secrets. If you would steal a secret from a player who has none left to steal, instead steal a secret from your own secrets zone if possible. Note that while a sacrifice must be made if the host's total deceit is higher by any amount, a secret is only stolen if the visitor's insight is higher by 4 or more. It sounds harder, but the way the math works out, both win conditions are roughly equally challenging to achieve. This also means that there's a window of 4 points where neither a sacrifice is made nor a secret stolen. After determining the outcome of the visit, the visiting player finally has the opportunity to recruit cards from the court, using their remaining visitors. Well, after any after visiting or after hosting effects are resolved, that is. Like always, the visitor effects trigger before the host effects, so resolve any after visiting effects on visitors, then resolve any after hosting effects on hosts. Okay, now it's the recruiting step. The visiting player totals the devotion of the remaining visitors and may spend it, divided any way they choose, to recruit any number of primordial cards from the court by paying their tribute cost. When recruited, cards go to the recruiting player's primordial discard zone face up. Some cards have a when recruited effect that will happen immediately upon recruiting. Unspent devotion does not carry over to future rounds. To recruit royals, there is an additional cost you must pay in addition to tribute, the sacrifice cost. To pay a royal's sacrifice cost, you must spend that many sacrifices from your sacrifice zone. But those cards aren't removed or anything, just spent for the turn. Mostly this just means that you have to have collected at least as many sacrifices as that royal's sacrifice cost. But if you put together some insane turn where you have like 18 devotion, you could theoretically recruit 2 royals in 1 turn, but only if you have enough sacrifices to pay both sacrifice costs together. Lastly, to conclude the turn, repopulate the court by putting cards from the top of the pawn and royal decks into the court until there are once again 7 face-up pawns and 7 face-up royals. If either deck runs out, repopulate the court as much as possible. And that concludes the turn. At this point, either move on to the next player's visit, or if all visits have been resolved, move to the round end. 3 things happen at the end of every round. Pass the first visitor token clockwise. Move all primordial cards from your visiting and hosting parties into your primordial discard zone, noting that there's a few cards that might stick around or affect the next round, signified with this symbol. And move your visiting intent card into your intent discard zone, unable to be used again until intents are reset. Speaking of which, intents are reset at the end of every 4th round. At the end of each 4th round, each player will have exactly 1 card left in their intent deck. That's when you'll scoop up all the intent cards you have access to, meaning all the intent cards you started the game with, and all of the secret intents that you have stolen thus far, most of which will be in your intent discard zone at this point, and choose any 5 cards from among them to move back into your intent deck zone, ready to be used again over the next 4 rounds. The remaining intent cards go back into your intent discard zone. Once all players have chosen which intents to reset, reveal your chosen cards to the other players before the next round's plotting phase begins. The last thing that happens at round end just happens once in a game. At the end of the 2nd round. During setup, we removed the most expensive pawns from the pawn deck. At the end of the 2nd round, when players will be shuffling their individual primordial discard zones into their decks for the first time, we'll also shuffle those expensive pawns back into the pawn deck, so more expensive pawns should slowly start to trickle their way into court. Alternatively, you don't have to go through the effort of separating out all of the expensive pawns from the deck every game. Just simply replace any pawn cards that cost 6 or more tribute that enter the court during those first 2 rounds. Still, make sure to shuffle those cards that you have set aside back into the deck at this point to get that good ratio. The game can end in 3 ways, actually. When a player collects their 6th secret, a player collects their 6th sacrifice, or when a player recruits the last royal from the court. When the game end is triggered, you'll finish out the round quickly to see if anyone else can tie it up or even pull ahead. If secrets caused the game to end, whoever stole the most secrets wins, with sacrifices being the tiebreaker. And if sacrifices caused the game to end, whoever has the most sacrifices wins, with secrets being the tiebreaker. And in those epic, rare games where royals actually cause the game to end, each player will count up each secret, sacrifice, and royal they ended up with the highest total being the winner. And that, fellow mortals, is pretty much the whole game. All that remains is a few glossary terms that are worth highlighting. There are glossary cards included in the game, but 3 terms that are on there that are worth explaining a little deeper here are captivate, silence, and move. Captivating a primordial reduces its insight and deceit to 0. Other effects can still add insight or deceit to that primordial if they trigger afterwards. All stat-changing effects only last for a turn, not an entire round. So if a host is captivated during one visit, and another player visits that same player in the same round, the captivated primordial stats will have reverted back to its printed numbers for that second visit. Silence zeroes out the parts of a primordial that captivate doesn't, namely its devotion and its effect. This is where the timing of when effects trigger is super important. With one royal exception, silence effects are resolved when visiting or when hosting, and since when visiting effects happen before when hosting effects, visitors are more often able to stop hosts' effects from triggering. Meanwhile, silencing a visitor is far from useless, even if you aren't stopping its effect, because remember, the other part of silence is reducing that primordial's devotion to 0. Silencing even one visitor can completely gut someone's recruitment plans. It's super rude, honestly, and my personal favorite thing to do. The last term that has some nuance to it beyond what is printed on the glossary card is move. Moving a card from one zone to another is self-explanatory, but what I want to stress is that once a card is in a new zone, it will act exactly as other cards in that zone act, uncaring of how it got there. For example, the sculptor moves a familiar from the court straight into your hosting party. That familiar is now firmly in your hosting party, meaning you will add its deceit to your total hosting power, but also meaning that it will get scooped into your discard zone at the end of the round, along with all of your other cards in your visiting and hosting parties. When you move a familiar or any other card in this way, even though it is basically being added to your deck, it is not being recruited, so its when recruited effect won't trigger. And speaking of the familiar's when recruited effect, a weird move that you'll find on some cards is the move to next round's visiting party. As we mere mortals are bound to live out our lives in a chronological line, moving a card to a future round is something we can only approximate. What we recommend is placing a card that is in next round's visiting party face up, slid halfway under the top of your player mat, near where your visitors go. Note that this card no longer exists in this round, so it will no longer affect totals or be affected by other cards. Once you dig into the cards, you'll find all sorts of effects that contradict some of the rules or produce some complex interactions. When that comes up, just try to do exactly what the card says, and if you have questions, you can check the last couple of pages of the rulebook, which has some clarifications in it, or head to our Board Game Geek forum. Good luck, have fun.